Is climate change real? I know most of you believe it is, and I was in your shoes a couple years ago. I believed all the headlines. I believed that CO2 was causing climate change. We have to stop burning oil so we reduce the amount of CO2 we produce. This is a serious problem. Well, a couple years ago, I started looking at the data that supports climate change, and what I found completely changed my mind. In this program, I'm going to present you with data that will convince you that climate change doesn't exist. The data is all readily available online, so this isn't some kind of unique data that you can't get to. And if you look at my articles, you'll find all the links to it. You can look at the data yourself, and I'll put links to my articles in the description. There is almost no data supporting the catastrophic headlines that you've been seeing. What if the information you've been getting in your news feeds and on social media is actually wrong, and we don't have a climate crisis? Well, that means your governments are making the wrong decision. They're taking your hard-earned tax money and spending it on things that make no sense. And that's exactly what's happening now. This is an important topic that everybody should be discussing. You need to demand evidence and data from your news outlets to prove their statement. Before I go any further, let's clear up a misconception. What is the difference between global warming and climate change? Now, if we go back 8 years ago, everybody was talking about global warming. And global warming is happening, but not nearly to the extent that people claim. But it is happening, and it is something to be concerned about. About 8 years ago, people seemed to lose interest in global warming. And so news outlets started calling it climate change. That sounds like a more serious problem, and so they were getting your attention with the word climate change. Those aren't the same thing, but at least half the time when people talk about climate change, they're actually talking about global warming. So when people say things like, oh, the glaciers are melting because of climate change, what they really mean is the glaciers are melting because of global warming. Temperatures are a little bit higher now. Global warming is really happening, and there are consequences to that. Ice is melting, glaciers are shrinking, permafrost is melting, the ice in the poles is getting less. Nobody's doubting those things, but that does not mean that there's a change in climate. Climate change deals with things like storms, floods, forest fire. We can't assume that climate change is happening just because we have global warming. So what do scientists believe? Well, they all believe that the Earth is warming. They also all believe that climate change is happening. Climates have always changed, and they're always going to continue to change. This has been happening for millions of years. Where scientists don't agree is on the extent of this change. The climate alarmists want you to believe that we're in a catastrophic situation and we have to do something in a hurry. The climate realists, they believe that it's changing, but not by very much. Now, you probably heard that 97% of scientists all agree that we're in a catastrophic situation. That's simply not true. There has never been a survey asking scientists their opinion. Many scientists believe that the climate changing right now is pretty minimal. The International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is a group that was put together by a lot of nations. Their job is to figure out if climate change is real and what the effects will be. Now, this organization is made up of scientists and politicians. The reports they produce are fairly good, but they are quite biased on the political side. The news outlets have convinced most people that the IPCC says this: climate change is an emergency, and we need to act now. Extreme weather is getting worse due to greenhouse gases. But what does the IPCC actually say? You can read the full report yourself. They're online. What the IPCC actually says in both their AR5 and AR6 reports is the following. There is no evidence of climate change beyond natural variability in the following areas: river flood, heavy precipitation, landslide, droughts, severe windstorm, tropical cyclones, sand and dust storm, heavy snowfall, ice storm, coastal flooding, marine heat waves, ocean acidification, risk of fire. The evidence for climate change over and above normal variability does not exist. There is, however, some evidence for global warming. It may not seem like it from the news, but the IPCC actually says there's almost no evidence for climate change. So let's go and have a look at the data and see what it tells us. Let's start with forest fires. In late winter of 2024, Canada had an unusually high number of forest fires for that time of year. And they were all over the news for several weeks because we had to evacuate a number of small communities because of the forest fire. The news outlets were predicting a terrible year for forest fires, and it was all blamed on climate change. And we heard that statement every night for weeks. Then one night, there was a little blurb that I think almost no one noticed. It was a report from the Alberta government. At that time, they had 150 active fires going. And they reported that every one of those fires were started by people. Now that's significant, but the news outlets never explained why that was important. So how do forest fires start naturally? When we have storms, there's lightning, and that lightning starts the forest fire. If we have climate change that's causing more storms and more severe storms, we end up with more lightning, which will cause more forest fire. And that's why an increase in forest fires is blamed on climate change. But it was pretty obvious in this case that all these forest fires were caused by people, not climate change. Here's a chart that shows the number of forest fires in Canada. You can see that there's a definite downward trend. For quite a few years now, we're seeing a decrease in forest fires. What about forest fires in the U.S.? California seems to have a tremendous number of forest fires now. The data shows that the number of forest fires in the U.S. is pretty constant or trending down slightly. There's no increase in forest fire. We also have very good data from the global forest fire, and these are all measured by satellite. Some people have argued that we should be looking at the amount of burnt area. How severe are these forest fires instead of the number? Now, I don't agree. I think the number is a better indication of climate change. Burnt area has more to do with how quickly we put out these forest fires. But let's have a look at the data anyway. So this graph shows us the amount of burned areas in the U.S. since 1926. You can see that the amount of burnt areas is coming down. It's not trending up. When we look at burnt area globally, we see a similar trend. The amount of burnt area is slowly trending down. The data on forest fires seems to be pretty clear. We're actually seeing the same number or a slightly reduction in forest fires. So what does this data tell us? The number of forest fires in Canada, the U.S., or globally is not increasing. The amount of burnt area in these areas is not increasing. This data does not support the idea that we have climate changing. Now, some news outlets have figured this out kind of slowly, but they're getting around to understanding the data. And so they've flipped their story. Now they are talking about the cost of forest fire. It's going up. The New York Times had this to say: costly and deadly forest fires really are on the rise. Shame on them. The fact that the cost of forest fires is going up has nothing to do with climate change. The cost of weather events goes up because there are more people living in these areas building more expensive homes. And so replacing them is more expensive. That has nothing to do with climate change. What about hot days? Are we experiencing more hot days than before? We have something called the heat wave index, which is commonly called the heat index. It's a measure of how hot it feels to our body. It takes into account the temperature and humidity. So this index may indicate climate change. Let's have a look at the data. Here's the U.S. Annual Heat Wave Index from 1895 to 2021. And this is produced by the EPA, so we can assume it's fairly reliable. There is no significant change in the trend. And in fact, the heat index value is much lower now than it was in the 30s. Keep in mind that CO2 levels have been rising since the 30s, and they're being blamed for the heat that's produced. What about actual temperature? Rather than looking at how it feels to us, what does the real temperature show us? Well, here's a chart for the US, and it indicates hot days. The chart shows the average number of hot days per year where the daily maximum temperature is above 95 degrees, 100 degrees, and 105 degrees. We don't see an increase in trend here. It was much hotter in the 30s than it is now. Another way to measure temperature is to look at the average annual temperature, and this chart shows that data for the US. There is a clear trend upwards over the last 100 years, but even in the last 20 years, there are highs and lows, and in many of these years, it's actually cooler than back in the 30s. Why is the average temperature increasing when the record highs are not? This seems contradictory until you look at the nighttime temperature. The average daily temperature is the average between the daily high and the daily low. If the nighttime temperature, the lows, are trending up and the daytime highs remain steady, the daily average goes up, and that is what's happening. Nighttime lows are getting warmer more quickly than daytime high. The reality is that heat waves are not worse than in the 30s. Temperatures are steadily going up. Average daily temperatures are going up mostly because the nighttime lows are warmer. Heat waves and record high temperatures are not nearly as extreme as reported by news. Are the number of storms increasing? We have very good data on this thanks to our satellites. They're measuring these all around the globe. Here's a chart showing global data. Tropical storms are not increasing. The number of hurricanes is stable or slightly decreasing. Major hurricanes are also stable. NOAA has reported on the number of major hurricanes that strike mainland U.S. for each decade since 1951. The average for the entire time was 5.6. The average since 2011 is only 3.5. The highest number occurred between 1941 and 1950, when they had 10. Clearly, the number of major hurricanes in the U.S. is not increasing. The data on storms is pretty clear. They're not getting worse. If you believe the latest trend, it's actually trending down. Is precipitation increasing? Are we getting larger rain events? Here's an interesting graphic that shows average precipitation around the globe, and it breaks the data down by region. If you have a look at those charts, you'll see that rainfall is pretty steady. There are ups and downs, but there's no clear upward or downward trend. Another way we can look at this data is to look at extreme one-day precipitation events. And I've got some data for the U.S. Overall, there's no clear trend in precipitation. This data does show a slight increase in values since the 1990s, but in the last few years, there's a downward trend. Overall, when we look at precipitation events around the globe, there really is no trend up or down. There are oscillations up and down, which are quite normal, and they're caused by the El Niño Southern Oscillation, what's known as the Enzo cycle. Volcanic activity also influences rainfall. The reality is that when we look at this data both globally and in the U.S., there's no significant upward trend in precipitation. What about coral reef? We've heard a lot about them in the news. They're all dying because of climate change. Now, oceans are getting warmer and they're absorbing more CO2, so there is a change in pH. They're getting more acidic. Both of those parameters will affect coral reefs. There are some important facts about coral reefs that news outlets seem to ignore. Coral thrives in warm water. That's why they're found in warm regions of the ocean. As the oceans warm up, we should actually see an increase in the amount of coral, or at least we'll see it migrate to more colder regions. Almost none of the coral reefs around the globe have been studied, so any statements about the coral reefs isn't based on fact. The most studied coral reef is the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. It's a huge, huge area, and only a very small part of that coral reef has been studied. Coral bleaching has reported a lot in the news. It does not mean the coral is dead. There are a number of reasons why we get bleaching in coral, and usually they recover after a few years. Coral is an old organism. They've been around for 60 million years. And in that time period, we've had great changes in climate. There have been huge changes in temperature, huge changes in CO2 levels, and yet they've survived for 60 million years. Now we're seeing slight warming and a slight decrease in pH, and suddenly everyone is worried that the coral is going to die out. Now, coral reefs are actually very difficult to study. We can fly over them and take pictures, but that only gives us information about the top of the coral reef. Think of coral reefs as sort of mountains. Most of the coral is down the side of the mountains and goes fairly deep. The only way to study the coral that's deeper down is with divers. That takes a huge amount of time and is really expensive, so we don't do very much of that. How is the Great Barrier Reef doing? Well, it's not dying. In fact, if anything, it's growing. It's getting larger. And it's getting larger at both the north end and the south end. Now, in the south end, you'd expect it to grow because the temperature is increasing, so coral can now expand into areas that were too cold before. The surprising thing is that it's also increasing in the northern end. Now, the northern end is in tropical temperatures, and so we'd expect an increase in temperature to cause it to slow down in growth, but in fact it's expanding there as well. The higher temperatures don't seem to be bothering. Here's a chart that estimates the amount of coral in the Great Barrier Reef. In the last couple years, the amount of coral has come down a bit, but you can see it's at an all-time high. How are coral reefs doing globally? Well, it's estimated that we might lose 30% of the coral reef, but not due to climate change. It's due to human activity. Ships are damaging the coral. Anchoring ships are damaging the coral. Pollution is very harmful. Fishing technique can be very harmful to the coral. And sediment runoff is a big problem. So coral reefs may be declining, but due to human activity, not climate change. The reality is, coral reef does not seem to be harmed by an increase in temperature. They are increasing in area where human activity is low. Are floods getting worse? There was a devastating flood in Texas Hill County recently. A number of people lost their lives, and it was on the news a lot. News outlets reported on it daily and commonly commented on the fact that climate change is going to make these types of events worse. So was this flood caused by climate change? You have to realize that this area is known as Flash Flood Alley. It's an area that regularly experiences these types of floods. They happen very quickly. The water levels rise very fast, and they've happened before. A single event does not prove climate change. When we're looking at climate change, we're looking at 30-year trends and changes, not a single one event. Roy Spencer, a climatologist and former NASA scientist, has done a good job in analyzing this data. The rainfall data shows that this was not an unusual event. Flood events have been trending down since the 1978 flood. A Department of Energy report concluded that when one looks at rainfall statistics across the U.S. extending back to the mid to late 1800s, there is little evidence of anything that might be considered relative to human-caused climate change. Now, trying to use flood events to determine climate change is really tricky. We are changing the landscape a lot with our buildings and roads. We're changing where the water flows and how it's collected. And it's difficult to separate that from the effect of just the rain. So even if there's an increase in flooding, it could be due to our own activity and not climate change. Earlier I looked at precipitation, and there didn't seem to be a big change in the amount of precipitation. So any change in flooding is probably due to us. The reality is, flood data does not show an increase in flooding in the U.S. Floods are largely influenced by our own activity on the land and have nothing to do with CO2 or climate. Is climate change a real threat? Now, scientists agree that climate is changing, but as you just seen from the data, the change is very small and the impact on climate events is very small. The only parameter that really seems to be changing at the moment is temperature. Now, is it a threat? Do we have to worry about that? The reality is the current changes are actually good for humanity. We are actually benefiting from global warming. Here's an interesting table that shows the effects of global warming since the 1900s. We have a reduction in death. We have a longer life expectancy. Countries are enjoying a higher GDP. That means people have more money to spend. There's less poverty. When we look at the factors that are important to humans, the benefits to humanity, we see that global warming is actually making our lives better. Now, I published this chart a little while ago, and a lot of people commented on it that they don't believe it. The high temperatures must be causing more deaths. So I had a closer look at that, and I have a separate program that looks at that in depth. I'll put a link to that in the description. The rise in temperature is actually saving about 650,000 lives a year. Now, another way to look at this is to look at the number of people that are killed by climate-related disasters. If the events are more severe, we'd expect an increase in the death rate. But in fact, what we see is the exact opposite. The reality is that the number of deaths from floods, droughts, storms, wildfires, and extreme temperatures has dropped dramatically. Now, most of this is due to human advancement in technology, but there is certainly no evidence of an increase. We can also look at the cost of climate disaster. The trend between 1990 and 2017 is down, not up. If disasters were more extreme, we would see the opposite effect. The reality is, global warming is saving lives and making our lives better. Climate change is not a threat. There is no crisis that we need to fix. When we look at the evidence for climate change, there isn't much to find. Even the IPCC says the evidence for climate change is minimal. It is important that we all understand these facts. I don't know why the news outlets get it so wrong, but I guess they're going for clicks and watch time. That's convincing the general population that we have a real crisis on our hands. And because the majority of the population feels that way, politicians are reacting to keep that group happy. They're making stupid decisions to make people happy. If the general population starts understanding we don't have a climate crisis, we can start making better governmental decisions. And that's why it's important for all of you to understand this information and pass it along to your friends. Now, that can be hard because your friends aren't going to believe you, so give them a copy of this video. Show them the data. The more people we can convince that climate change is not a threat, the better off we'll all be. Thank you very much for your support. If you'd like to connect directly with me, the best way is through my Facebook group, Garden Fundamentals. We'll answer all of your questions there. I also have a blog called Garden Myths, where I've debunked over 2,000 different myths. I'll put links to all of these in the description below. Happy gardening.